The movie begins with a narration that tells us about how a group of costumed heroes called the Watchmen were formed to fight crimes. They comprises of a guy called the comedian, Night Owl, Manhattan, Laurie, and Rorschach. None of them has superpowers apart from Dr. Manhattan, who is seen as a god as he can do almost anything with his powers. In 1980, the public opinion shifted against custom heroes, who were viewed as the risky alternative to police. The costume heroes was later banned by the government due to the protest from the people. In 1985, at the street of New York, we see a blood splash close to a gutter, but what's surprising about this scene is we see people stepping on it with no atom of care of what happened. Two cops shows up at the house of Edward Blake, the man that was killed. According to their investigations, due to the door chains were fastened on the inside, they believe someone as strong as a man on serious drugs busted inside the house. The other detective claims he saw the body of the victim. Edward Blake looked strong enough to protect himself as he had muscles like a weightlifter. They research about the background of the victim to find out he was doing overseas diplomatic work for years, and he has even shaked hands with the vice president. At the end of their investigation, they concluded that since the victim was thrown off the window, this wasn't just a simple burglary but an assassination. They had no lead on who's responsible and decided to close the case. Later that night, a costume hero called Rorschach enters the house of the victim to investigate the murder. He is the only Watchmen member that refuses to retire as far crime in the city continues. He finds a signature smiley face pin badge, and after searching the house carefully, he finds a costume. This costume belongs to a Watchmen member called the Comedian, so Rorschach realizes that Edward Blake was the Comedian, a masked hero who used to work for the government. The scene changes to show as a retired Watchmen member called Daniel having a section with his friend Hollis. They laughed and talked for long concerning their past heroic activities, but Daniel, looking at the time, decided to head home as it's almost midnight. Daniel arrives at his home to meet his door open. He enters prepared to take down whoever broke into his house, but finds out it's just his old comrade, Rorschach. Rorschach informs Daniel that the comedian is dead. Someone threw him out of the window. Daniel takes Rorschach to his workshop so they can discuss about this further. Daniel tells Rorschach not to overthink this too much as it might have just been an ordinary burglary. Maybe the killer didn't know about Blake's identity as the comedian, but Rorschach refuses to believe that an ordinary burglar is capable of killing the comedian. Daniel once again feels it might be a political killing since the comedian used to work for the government, but Rorschach believes there is someone who is hunting down every member of the Watchmen. He tells Daniel to be careful as people who hates them are everywhere, and leaves to continue his investigations about the murderer. Memories flashes through Daniel's mind as he stares at the comedian badge. We see a flashback where Daniel, known as a custom hero called the Night Owl, was trying to stop a riot along with the comedian. The people revolt because they want cops to be fighting crimes instead of costume heroes. Comedian fights the protesters and shoots gas grenades at them. Daniel, clearly disturbed by the state of lawlessness, asks the comedian what happened to the American dream. The comedian replies that he is staring at it. Back to the present, Rorschach uses extreme measures during his investigations. He breaks a guy's finger at the bar and repeatedly asks for the killer's whereabouts. He depressingly stays at the roof after confirming that no one at the bar knows the killer. He goes to meet the rest of the retired Watchmen members to warn them about the killer. He meets Adrian Veidt, the smartest man in the world, and a retired member who also believes the comedian death was just a political killing. Adrian recalls a Watchmen meeting where he remembers the comedian as a sarcastic misanthropic pessimist, whereas Adrian then was desiring to help humanity. The comedian destroyed Adrian's display, claiming that the threat of nuclear war outweighs any effort by Adrian's proposed crime-buster group. On his way to meet another retired member called Manhattan to warn him about the killer, Rorschach explains to us that before the Watchmen even existed, there was a band of heroes called the Minutemen which the comedian once belonged. But these groups didn't last long as some committed suicide, while some were arrested for breaking the law themselves. Rorschach sneaks into the U.S. Army Military Research Center to meet Manhattan, but his girlfriend Laurie, also a retired member of the Watchmen, doesn't seem to welcome him as she asked why he is not in prison. The government allowed her to stay with Manhattan in his research center so he can be relaxed and happy. Manhattan reveals he already knows about the comedian death since him and the comedian are the only extra-normal operatives that work for the government. Manhattan doesn't care about his death since he has no human feelings, and Laurie doesn't either because comedian and her mother were both Minutemen members and she hates him for once trying to rape her mother. Laurie and Rorschach argue, but Manhattan immediately teleports Rorschach out of the center as he is upsetting his girlfriend Laurie. Laurie tells Manhattan that she wants to use a night out. Rorschach mentioned Daniel, her only friend in the Watchmen who she hasn't seen for years. She wants to call him and ask him to dinner, which Manhattan seems to have no problem with. Manhattan tells us about how the United States government sent him to intervene in the Vietnam War in 1971. He was deployed alongside with the comedian. He states he has never met anyone who lacked moral sense like the comedian, who is unconcerned with right or wrong. Just as the war was over, the comedian drinks in a bar and thanks Manhattan for helping the United States win the war. A Vietnamese woman later enters the bar and informs him that she is pregnant with his child, but when the drunken comedian refuses to accept responsibility for his actions, the woman angrily smashes his face with a bottle. In retaliation, he kills the woman with his gun. Manhattan talks about how despicable he is for gunning down a pregnant woman, but the comedian tells him he is no different because he watched him pull the trigger but did nothing when he could have turned his gun into a steam or could have teleported the woman. He has been observing Manhattan ever since and knows he doesn't give a damn about human beings. Laurie gives Daniel a call and they decided to meet up at Gunga dinner. Just as Laurie reunites with Daniel, he asks about her relationship with Manhattan. She said everything is fine, but her worries is she is clocking 35 this year and all she can think is what she has done with her life. She has spent 8 years semi-retired, preceded by 10 years running around in a stupid costume just because her mother wants her to. Few days later, Laurie goes to see her mother in California. She reveals Manhattan is attending the comedian funeral, and just as she refused to go, he teleported her here. Laurie is angry to see her mother sad concerning his death after he tried to rape her 40 years ago. Laurie's mother Sally was a member of the Minutemen, so is the comedian. Now that he's dead, it's just her, Hollis, and Byron that are the only survivals of the Minutemen. Her mother looks at a sexy photo of herself, which Laurie is irritated by, but her mom reveals she keeps the picture as it reminds her how attractive she used to be to people. We are then taken to a flashback where we see Sally and the other members of the Minutemen, including the comedian, taking a group photo in a wood panel club. Sally later goes to the billiards room to change out of her costume. During that moment, the comedian walks inside the room and begins making seductive moves towards her. Sally pushes him away, but the comedian punches her brutally, and just as he is about to rape her, another member of their team called Hooded Justice enters and intervenes by punching the comedian on his face repeatedly. Back to the burial of the comedian, we see a tall man wearing a hat paying his respect at the comedian's grave. We find out his name is Moloch, an enemy to the comedian from the past. Just as Moloch got home, Rorschach comes out of his fridge and attacks him. He breaks his hand and demanded to know why Moloch attended the funeral. Moloch tells him he is now retired from being a criminal. The reason he only visited the graveyard was because he felt he had to. He knew the comedian's real identity to be Edward Blake because he broke into his house to see him 2 weeks ago and his mask was off. The comedian was at his house drunk saying things that didn't make sense. The comedian cries about a list and regrets about doing the things he did, like raping women and killing children, and after that he left. Rorschach doesn't believe Moloch's story and asks him what phony medications are doing inside his cupboard. Moloch reveals he has cancer, and those drugs are meant for prolonging his life a little. The scene changes to show us Manhattan romancing Laurie in a bed. She opens her eyes and is startled that Manhattan has duplicated himself. She is initially turned off by making love with 2 people at the same time, and she later realized that the original Manhattan body is working on an energy design. Laurie gets angry because Manhattan for once doesn't give her his full attention, but just always focused on work. She breaks up with Manhattan and goes to visit Daniel, claiming she has nowhere else to go. She expresses to Daniel what it's like to live with Manhattan. For Manhattan, the real world is like walking through mist, and all the people are just shadows. She asks Daniel to take her out and get some air, which he happily agrees to. Just as they walk around the street, some gang members sees them and follows them. They get attacked, but Daniel and Laurie single-handedly defeats the gang with their combat skills. Meanwhile, Manhattan puts on a suit and a tie, and then attends a live interview called The Benny Anger Show to answer some questions. The reporters there accuses Manhattan for infecting many of his colleagues with cancer. His best friend, Wally Weaver, died of cancer. And before Laurie, Manhattan had dated a girl called Janie Slayer, who was also recently suffering from lung cancer. They believe he is the one responsible for giving them cancer, and hundreds of people in the city might have gotten it because of him. Manhattan gets so fed up by these allegations, and as he screams for them to leave him alone, he realizes that he has mistakenly turned everyone at the interview to dust. Manhattan, who is in regret on what he has done, travels to Mars through teleportation and begins to recall his past memories like what turned into the superpower being he is. Before Manhattan became what he is, he was just an ordinary boy called John, living with his father who repairs watches. In 1945, when he was 16 years old, he practices on how to repair watches as he admired his father's work, but his father gets angry seeing him doing that. His dad informs him on the news on how atomic bomb was being dropped in Japan and wants him to study atomic science as that's what the world needs, not the repairing of watches. In 1958, John graduated with a PhD in atomic physics. In 1959, thanks to his best friend Wally, John got to work in a lab where intrinsic field experiments happen. Later that day, Waller took John to a crowded bar and introduces him to a research scientist called Janie Slayer. In 1960, him and Janie Slayer went to an amusement park where they ended up falling in love with each other, and they made love after a little argument. Just as they both hang out at a bar, Janie asks him about her broken watch, which he had promised to repair for her. He revealed he has fixed it, but forgot it in his lab coat. Just as John goes to the lab to get the watch, he gets trapped by an atomic chamber by a time lock. He calls on Janie and other scientists to help him out, but they couldn't as the time lock cannot be override. Just as the lock reaches zero, a bright light comes out of the chamber and turns John into dust. A funeral for John was held later that year, but John was not actually dead as the chamber had transformed him from a human scientist to Manhattan. John gradually resurrected first as a nervous system, then as a human skeleton, and then finally into a blue humanoid. He appears before Janie in his blue humanoid form, revealing he's John. Janie didn't run away like most women would, but decided to still love him despite his scary looks, and they both got married. According to the TV news, when John is told he needs a logo, he draws a circle with a dot on the center of his forehead representing a hydrogen atom. The American president at that time named him the Manhattan and enlisted his assistance in ending the Vietnam War, which he accomplishes. Just as Manhattan went on an outing with Janie, he noticed a young woman looking at him who was revealed to be Laurie. He sleeps with Laurie later that night, and Janie, who later finds out about this, divorces him in tears. Back to the present, Manhattan says he is tired of Earth and tired being caught in the tangle of human lives. He decides to build a clock-like building and decided to live in Mars. Since her breakup with Manhattan, Daniel finds out that Laurie has been staying in the hotel. He suggested she move into his house, which she agrees to. The scene takes us to show us Adrian, a retired member of the Watchmen. Yvonne, an assistant in his toy company, informs him about some business leaders who have come to see him. Just as the elevator door opens, a delivery man tries to shoot Adrian, but he avoided it. The bullet killed his assistant Yvonne. Adrian subdues the shooter, but the man swallows a poison pill and dies. According to his research, Rorschach finds out that the person that tried to kill Adrian is connected with Moloch. He goes to Moloch's apartment only to find out he has been killed. The police surrounds the building and Rorschach is still inside. He realized that all these is a setup as the police think he was the one who killed Moloch. Rorschach uses a spray and fire to fight his way out of the building, but regardless, he is outnumbered, captured, and unmasked. And that was how the movie ended. Thank you for watching, guys. If you love animation movies, please subscribe to this channel and keep watching. Bye.